Good evening, and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Sabrina Hartono, and I am one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows for this year. The spring of my freshman year, I took my first Introduction to American Politics class, as most of you have or will be taking as well. As an international student, Gov 20 was a class I approached with interest and slight amusement. Coming into the class as someone who has only seen the events of Trump's victory unfold from an outsider's perspective, and not really having any prior background knowledge of the country's political development, I was really interested to understand, what is happening to America? Our speaker tonight will be sharing with us why he argues that party hacks and smoke-filled rooms are part of the solution to the chaos and seeming dysfunctionality in the US government. Jonathan Rauch, a senior fellow at Brookings and a contributing writer for The Atlantic, is the author of 7 books, including The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50, published last year. A recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award, the magazine industry's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, he has written many articles on public policy, culture, and government, biological rhythms, height discrimination, gay marriage, and number inflation. A graduate of Yale University, Rauch became a reporter for the Winston-Salem Journal in North Carolina before moving to Washington in 1984. From 1984 to 89, he covered fiscal and economic policy for the National Journal. In 1990, he spent 6 months in Japan as a fellow of the Japan Society Leadership Program. In his most recent ebook, Political Realism: How Hacks, Machines, Big Money, and Backroom Deals Can Strengthen American Democracy, Rauch challenges today's conventional wisdom about what ails American government and politics, and show how a new generation of realist thinkers are building reforms for our time. Mr. Rauch's Athenaeum presentation is co-sponsored by the Salvatore Center at CMC. As always, I must always remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please silence and put away your mobile devices at this time, and join me in welcoming Jonathan Rauch to the Athenaeum.
Hello, everybody. It is such an honor to be here with you. It's such a delight to not be in Washington, D.C. today. I can only tell you that up close, it looks even worse. It's also a source of great joy and privilege to be part of this series. If you've looked at the Hall of Fame of people who speak here, it's one of the great speaking series in the United States. And the kinds of names on this list are the kinds of people I always wanted to grow up and imagine to be part of. So it's a fantastic thing. And then CMC, one of the country's great schools, a place that takes liberal arts education seriously, deeply invests in its undergraduates. I know people from there. They're remarkable people. And the people in this room will go on and do remarkable things, especially thanks to my hosts tonight, Zach Corser, George Thomas, Priya Janar, who unfortunately isn't with us tonight, though she should be, and the Salvatore Center. How many of you know what happens on October 1st? Anybody? We have a political science professor who knows, who used to work in Washington, D.C. What's the answer?
Start of the fiscal year for the federal government.
Start of the fiscal year for the federal government. That means that a week from today, the government needs to be funded or it will shut down. What's supposed to happen, or to have happened by now, is that a series of spending bills called appropriations bills should have passed. There are 12 or 13 of them. This used to be a routine part of business in Washington. The subcommittees and the appropriations committees would poll all the members of Congress and then pool all the requests and then talk to all the people in the bureaucracies and the agencies and negotiate with the White House and put together appropriations bills, and that's how the budget was done. Would anyone care to guess of the 12 appropriations bills for fiscal 2020, which begins in a week, how many have been passed as of today? I'm seeing the right answer. Sir, in the pink shirt. 0. Did you know that, or were you just guessing? Just a lucky guess. That's correct. The number is 0. Since 2010, the number has usually, though not always, been 0. The last year in which the budget process was actually completed on time was fiscal 1997. Raise your hand if you were not born in 1997. There you go. So, startlingly, majority of people in this room don't have living memory of when Congress functioned routinely as a legislative body. Think about it. Not in your lifetime have you witnessed Congress succeeding in doing its job. The Bipartisan Policy Center, which is bipartisan, has something called a Healthy Congress Index. The last Congress, the 115th, when it ended, here was the headline on their report: 115th Congress functioned poorly, derelict in basic duties. The assessment was, most significantly, Congress did not meet its most basic duty to fully fund the government, which resulted in several shutdowns of the government over the 2-year period. In late 2018, for the first time ever, a shutdown from one Congress carried over into the next. That's something new, at least. The White House, does it look orderly to anybody in this room? Trump's just gone through into his 4th national security advisor in less than 3 years. The number of days in which cabinet positions, that's days times cabinet positions, vacancy days, were empty is 4 times the previous record, which was under President Clinton. We've only seen the passage of 2 major pieces of legislation in this presidency. One was criminal justice reform, another was a tax cut. You'll notice that, for example, the big wall isn't built, the infrastructure bill never happened, and so forth. We see government by tweet. In the campaign, we saw in 2016 that, of course, the Republican race was hijacked by a candidate who was not even in any meaningful sense a Republican, and the same almost happened in the Democratic campaign. 3 of the 4 final contenders that year were people who actually ran against their own parties. Hillary Clinton was the only member in good standing of her party of the final 4 in 2016. In 2020, the Democrats are more orderly than the Republicans. We've seen more than 20 of these candidates, and one of them is not even a Democrat. We saw a successful red state governor who was excluded from the debates to make room for his self-help guru, things that would be inconceivable 20 or 30 years ago. We see congressional races that are increasingly dominated by extreme candidates who are picked in very low turnout primaries by groups that are not at all representative of the larger electorate. So, it's a laundry list. You know some of this stuff, some of it you don't know. Today, I don't want to talk. It's hard not to talk about Donald Trump. It's always hard not to talk. It's hard not to dream about Donald Trump. I want to talk today about the system that gave us Donald Trump, the chaos that gave rise to Donald Trump, and the chaos that he and other people like him in the future have been and will be able to exploit. I don't think that Trump caused chaos. I think chaos, he exacerbated it. He exploited it. But chaos caused Donald Trump. And I want to suggest an idea which will seem strange to some of you, at least those of you who haven't read my work on the subject. But it's a growing school, and it's all rooted in actually very traditional mainstream political science. So for 50 years, we in Washington, the activist world, the reform community, academia, and so forth, we've been obsessed with corruption in politics. You know, drain the swamp. We've worried about corporate influence and fat cat contributions and crony capitalism and lobbyists and revolving doors and all the rest of it. To put this a little puckishly, not accurately, but in a way you'll remember when you leave the room, what if the actual problem is too little corruption? What if what we need actually is, in a sense, more bad government? Now, I don't mean that literally. I'm for good government. We want government to work. But I'm also for the proposition that in any functioning political system, the right amount of corruption is always a number greater than 0. So, why? Spin the dial back 1985, 1984, 85, 86, in there. I'm a young reporter in my 20s in Washington, D.C. I'm writing on the budget for a magazine called National Journal, which includes the appropriations process. And I get interested in the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. Now this one, I'll be surprised if a hand goes up, but one might. Raise your hand if you've heard of Jamie L. Whitten. Nobody. Jamie Whitten, anybody? Anybody been to Washington, D.C. and been on the mall? A few of you? So if you drive past the Agriculture Department building and look closely, you will see that it is named the Jamie L. Whitten Department of Agriculture building. Jamie L. Whitten came to the House of Representatives before Pearl Harbor in 1941 and served until 1995. He was the longest serving member of Congress ever until John Dingell beat his record. He sat for many years as chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture, where he basically ran the Agriculture Department. He was legendary for that. They called him the unofficial Secretary of Agriculture, and then he graduated to become chairman of the full committee. Jamie Whitten was a Southerner. He was from northern Mississippi. He had a very thick accent, and even with the accent, he talked as if he had a mouthful of marbles. You often couldn't understand what he said unless he wanted you to understand what he was saying, which was not very often. He boasted, he bragged, that he had never in his entire career of Congress issued a press release or had a press conference. His philosophy is if you're talking about it in public, you're not getting it done. Chairman Whitten's style was to work in the background quietly in the recesses of the Appropriations Committee process, talking to people, pork barreling. Oh, was he ever a pork barrel? He practically wallpapered his district in northern Mississippi with federal money, including the original bridge to nowhere. It was a waterway to nowhere. It was called the Tennessee-Tombigbee Waterway. It's a great waterway, actually no boats ever sailed on. He was famous for, he'd schedule his appropriations votes for weird times of day and give little warning, and then he'd pop up on the House floor and the gavel would come down and the bill would go through before anyone had even read the bill. He was seen by reformers as a relic of the old days, the backroom deals, exactly the kind of thing that's wrong with Washington. But as I learned Washington and saw how things work, my view of Chairman Whitten began to change. I began to notice that even though he was called by one of the reformers, and I quote, former member, one big puddle of sneak, that in his own sneaky way, he was restraining spending. He was figuring out who needed what in order to get these bills through. He was artfully building coalitions. He was serving the leadership in Congress who would call him up. He didn't work for them. He was an independent power, but they could call him up when they needed help, and they would figure out how to get stuff done. He was very effective at doing what he did. And sure enough, when the appropriations process was all but dismantled by Newt Gingrich and his successors and Jamie Lee Whitten disappeared, there has been no substitute. And we don't have a budget. Why not? Dial back even further. Raise your hand. I know a few hands will go up in this one. The political science PhDs will know this one. George Washington Plunkett. Raise your hand. A couple. I see someone that looks like George in the back there. George is nodding. So the poli-sci PhDs know who George Washington Plunkett is. There's a reason for this. George Washington Plunkett is taken very seriously in the world of academic political science. He invented the concept of honest graft, among other things. He was not a political scientist. George Washington Plunkett was a functionary of the Tammany Hall political machine, which was the machine that ran New York city and state for over 100 years, notorious machine. We'll talk about it some more in a minute. He was a functionary, and he had the dubious honor of simultaneously holding 4 public offices and drawing 3 public salaries. He became a millionaire in his service to the machine. His famous slogan was, "I seen my opportunities and I took them." He was proud of that. Plunkett used to stand on the steps of the New York County Courthouse in Manhattan at the shoeshine box and hold forth about politics. And a reporter named William Reardon took down his lectures and published them in a little book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall, 1905. You can get it for free online. It's really short, and it is hilarious. You'll laugh your head off, and you can read it all in a plane trip. But it's serious stuff. So Plunkett had the concept of honest graft. This is the difference between what he calls looters and politicians. And here's how he explains it. He says, I won't try to do this in the New York accent or the Irish brogue or whatever it would have been. He says, the looter goes in for himself alone without considering his organization or his city. The politician looks after his own interests, the organization's interests, and the city's interests all at the same time. See the distinction? For instance, I ain't no looter. The looter hogs it. I never hogged. I made my pile in politics. But at the same time, I serve the organization and get more big improvements for New York City than any other living man. So the guy's not a comedian. Tammany Hall today is a byword for corruption because the progressives hated it, but there's been a lot of scholarship now that's looked back at Tammany and realized that along with the corruption, it was very effective at running New York. It was a school for politics for immigrants who would come in. It would pull them into politics, get them engaged, promote them through the ranks. It also became the place where people, the poor went, the working class went for social welfare help. They'd go to the machine. You know, you're a widow and you can't get by this week. You go to the machine and the machine would find some volunteers to help you out. In fact, the New Deal welfare programs were based to some large extent on the Tammany Hall innovations in welfare. So a lot of things were happening here that were making government work. In fact, interesting fact, there are remnants of this system even to this day, and sort of the last member of the Tammany Hall group actually died as recently as this past February, age 84. His name was James McManus. He was a professional undertaker, but also leader of the McManus Midtown Democratic Association. This is Hell's Kitchen, New York. The Economist had a wonderful obit. I'll just read a few lines to give you the flavor of it. Every Monday and Thursday at the clubhouse in the West 40s, all sorts of petitioners would come through the door. They wanted apartments, jobs, advice with tax forms, help to clear the junkies from the next door stoop. He could do most of that with one phone call. Each favor, he hoped, would earn a vote for the Democratic Party. He also opened wide the clubhouse doors to the new folk moving in. The wisdom of political compromise was something he also understood. Economists went on to note there were blots on his copybook, such as letting 9 of his relatives and friends give the funeral parlor as their voting address. I don't mean to romanticize these guys. I don't mean to romanticize corruption and say that they're all great. On the other hand, a lot of political scientists for many years have appreciated what these guys were up to. These are the big names in political science. These are not marginal people. This is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, James Q. Wilson, Nelson Polsby. Many others took a hard look at what these folks were doing and noticed that what they were doing was organizing politics, what Wilson called assembling power in the formal government. This is something that the Constitution does not provide for. The Constitution sets up institutional structures and checks and balances and all of that, but it left something out. It doesn't make politicians accountable to each other. Each and every member of Congress, plus the president, the only exception is the vice president, who's elected on someone else's ticket, each and every one of those individuals is voted for from his own or her own constituency as an individual. So they can do anything they want. All they need to worry about is re-election in their district. So the question is, if you're Speaker Pelosi, and you need to try to get all these people to function together to get a budget passed, and maybe the vote is very hard for somebody in their own district, how do you get them to do it? Well, it turns out that building coalitions, creating all of these networks of people, all of the indebtedness, the capital, all of the stuff that you need so that politicians don't go rogue, don't go renegade, don't become antisocial and put self-interest, raw, naked political self-interest above everything else, it's really hard. It's very hard. It makes brain surgery look simple. Way back in 1962, James Q. Wilson, one of his earliest books, underappreciated, it's a book called The Amateur Democrat, looked at how reformers were trying to, and at that point succeeding, in tearing down the old political machines in 3 big American cities. And he viewed this as at best a mixed blessing. And here's what he said would happen increasingly, he believed, as what he called amateurs replaced careerists in politics. By amateurs, he meant people who were motivated not by, for instance, greed, traditional corruption status, jobs for their friends, pork barrel, or people, calling them Your Honor, what he called extrinsic rewards. This other group, amateurs, were people who were interested in what he called intrinsic rewards. They were high-minded, idealistic people who were in politics because of issues, like abortion or gun control, global warming, whatever it might be. The problem with being in politics for issues is that issues are really hard to transact. If you believe abortion is murder, well, how many airport runways in your district does it take to sanction the murder of babies? The answer is it's very hard to transact that. So he noticed is you get more and more of these amateurs, these ideologues, what now political scientists call political hobbyists in many cases, because they all have other jobs that they go back to. Here's his prediction for what would happen, and I quote, and this is 1962, I was 2 years old. Political conflict will be intensified, social cleavages will be exaggerated, party leaders will tend to be men skilled in the rhetorical arts, and the party's ability to produce agreement by trading issue-free resources, meaning basically pork barrel spending, will be reduced. When I read those words, and I was working on political realism, 2014, 15, this is before Trump came along, I felt a chill go down my spine because it was such an accurate prediction of where we would wind up 50 years later. And as we'll see, he's not the only person to get that prediction right. So let's talk for a bit about some of the political science, the political mechanics that we think is going on here. So we've got all these actors in politics. They're all independently elected. They're not accountable to each other in the Constitution. If someone votes to shut down the government and I'm the Speaker of the House, I can't fire them. I can't really do much of anything to them in the Constitution. What do? Well, James Madison, as some of you know, the architect of the Constitution, was against the ideas of political parties. He thought they were corrupt factions. But guess what? As soon as the Constitution was adopted in the 1790s, the very first thing he and Thomas Jefferson did was go out and start a political party, one whose remnant remains with us to this day, in the form of the Democratic Party. The reason for that is that you have to build all of these networks, these complicated hierarchies and networks to coordinate politics, to do the hard work of brokering, negotiating, finding out what people want, building connections to each other. So what are we talking about? We're talking about professionals, careerists, hacks, political machines, which are really accountability networks of politicians who have ways to reward and sometimes punish each other. They're really favor economies. And above all, political parties, which are the lasting institutional repositories for these kinds of activities. Parties are the only entities in American politics that don't have 2 to 6 year to maybe 8 years if you're president time horizon. They've been with us 150 years and more, so they've got to think about their brands in the future. They've got to worry about governing, not just running for elections. So what are they doing? Lots of things, some things that are important, maybe worth singling out for our purposes. They're taking a longer term view, as I just mentioned. They don't always, they've got to worry about the next election, but they can't worry only about the next election. They've got to worry about their brand. They've got to worry about what's happening down the road from now. You can believe that there are a lot of Republicans who are very, very worried right now about where their party is headed under Trump, and that's their job to be worried about. They make deals among factions inside the party. That's really hard. If you think about how divided the Democratic Party is or the Republican Party, getting those people together so that you can get a majority every single day to pass bills in Congress, very difficult. You don't want to have to start over with scratch, building a brand new coalition. You've got to have a lot of background work going on. And then once you've got a deal in your party or in your group, then you've got to make a deal with the other party. Parties do that too. They lead these negotiations. They can go to the other side. Sometimes it's very contentious and adversarial, but actually, especially in the old days, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was, what do you need? What do we need? Then they can hold themselves accountable to these deals because they've got the longer term incentives. They incentivize teamwork, hugely important. They've got all kinds of mechanisms to punish people who go renegade, but mostly they don't punish. Mostly they incentivize. That's what pork barrel spending is about to a large extent. It's positive incentives. You want to make friends in politics, not enemies. So if you're Chairman Whitten, you want to know what everybody needs. You want to help them solve their problems. That's a lot of what the machines were doing. If you can do that, you create indebtedness to you, they create indebtedness to them. That builds the deeper connections that become political capital. It's often forgotten. In America, I don't think we even teach this, but in America, the written constitutions may be 10 or 15% of what makes politics work. The rest is soft political capital. It's soft power. It's indebtedness, favors, people who know each other, people who owe each other, people who campaign for each other, people who know that the other person's word is as good as gold. It's all of that social capital. And then finally, super important, some political scientists have argued this is the most important thing, they recruit and vet candidates. So how did George H.W. Bush get into politics? Because his father got into politics. He was a senator from Connecticut. How did his father get into politics? He was a prominent citizen. The Republican Party in Connecticut came and tapped him on the shoulder and said, wouldn't you like to run for Senate? To which the answer was frankly, no, I'm very busy, I have a life. Well, you want people in politics who are busy and happy and have a life. You don't want ideologues who have nothing to do all day but sit around and tweet on Twitter or do Instagram. So the parties would then say something like, well, I think we can make it very easy for you to run. They couldn't guarantee a spot, but they could put a thumb on the scales. They do this because they identify here's some political talent or someone with a lot of community connections. And then if you work out, they'll promote you through the ranks. They'll say, why don't you run for governor? Maybe why don't you run for president? Much more important, I have a friend in North Carolina, county party, Democratic Party chairman. Suppose someone says, you know what, I'm ready to be governor and I'm running. And the person is a total, I'm trying to use a non-colorful word. Let's just say they're not qualified, and they'll probably lose. That person's job is to go to them and say, you know, we love you, but I don't think that's the right race for you. Have you thought about school board? We can help you with that campaign. With the other campaign, I'm kind of sorry to say we wouldn't be able to help you. We might actually have to oppose you. So what they're doing is creating a pipeline of people who know how to govern or who learn how to govern and then who build capital responsible for each other. Now, this all sounds great. What does it mean in practice? This is where it gets tricky, right? Because you can take the individual practices that these backroom dealers and professionals are doing. If you hold them up to the light of bright, brilliant sunshine, individually, they don't look so good. I'm Speaker Rauch. I need Zach Corser's vote. It's a painful vote for him. It's a debt limit bill. He might even face a primary challenge as a result of voting for the debt limit bill. What do? Well, I can't force him to vote for the bill. I go to Zach and I say, maybe you could use some money for your next campaign. My political action committee is good for $50,000, $100,000. I'd love to be able to support you. Maybe you say, hey, Zach, you know that second runway for that airport in your district that you've been asking about? We've never been able to get around to that. I think maybe this might be the year we could do that. You go to Zach in private. You don't want to have this conversation in public with the TV lights on because you know Zach's answer will be, absolutely not. I'm incorruptible. In the back room, adults can say things like this, and then they can do the complicated deals, which are the really hard ones, where you need a lot of sign-offs and you don't have any deal. No one's in until everyone's in. You got to know a lot about what the bottom line is. So you need some privacy, right? So you can't have the cameras and the reporters there all the time. You need some seniority. You can say to Zach, I'd love to be able to promote you. I know you've wanted that seat. You've been on foreign affairs. You don't like it. I know you want to do appropriations. Maybe we can do that. You want seniority, right? You want people who've hung around a long time, even if they're not the most competent people, because seniority suggests they've been there for a while, they know their stuff, and they've probably been team players most of that time if they've been promoted. Above all, you need to be able to say to Zach something like, well, I think we have ways of discouraging a challenge in your district. No guarantees, you can't control who runs, but we can make it harder for your challenger, or we can make it easier for your challenger. Which would you rather it be? And then Zach might look at all that and he'd say, yeah, sure, Speaker Rauch, I think I can give you that vote. And maybe he does, and then I say something like, that's fine, I need this vote this time, you're gonna get a free pass on this next thing. And that's how it works, right? But if you tell people that the tools you need include pork barrel spending, in other words, wasted money, campaign contributions, in other words, big money from, soft money, it's sometimes called. You need secrecy, backroom deals. You need to reward people for, just longevity instead of expertise, old people. And you need to rig the election system, not rig it, but you need to influence it. Well, none of that looks good. Now, these things, I want to emphasize, they're not good in themselves. I am not a huge fan of putting a second runway in Zach Corsier's district because I actually don't think he should have an airport there at all. But they're tools, right? You need tools. If you hire a plumber and then you say, by the way, I really don't like the wrench or the screwdriver, leave them at home, you're not going to get the sink fixed. So the tools can be used for ill, and they are. But they can also be used for good, and the problem is if you don't have the tools, the stuff doesn't get done. You wind up getting chaos. Now, so they can be used for good. Most famous example of this, 1964 Civil Rights Bill. Lyndon Johnson couldn't pass it because it was stuck in the House because the Southern Democrats wouldn't vote for it. So he went to the Republicans. He went to the Republican leader, a man named Charlie Halleck, and he said, Charlie, what do you need? And Halleck said, that research grant for Purdue University in my district, wouldn't Purdue be the ideal place to study outer space? Johnson said, I think we can make that happen. To this day, there is a major research center in Purdue. That got the Civil Rights Bill through, 1964. Renegade protection, protection against spoilers. As we all know, in 2016, the Republican Party establishment was intensely unhappy with Trump, partly because of the way he behaved, of course, but partly because they assumed he would lose the election. And by the way, he did lose the election by 3 million votes. They were right about that. They just got lucky, thanks to some help from the Russians, and 77,000 votes in 3 cities. But the point is, everyone said, why don't you stop this guy? And the answer was because we can't. We no longer have the tools to do that. That wasn't always true. In 1924, Henry Ford, the auto magnate who sounded a lot like Trump, he was promising to clean out the government. He said we need a strong authority figure who can get stuff done. And he was issuing anti-Semitic and racist rants in the Dearborn Independent. There was a national groundswell to run him for president. Everyone wanted him. And he started floating trial balloons and making clear that he was gettable. One problem, neither the Republican Party gatekeepers nor the Democratic Party gatekeepers would stand for him. In those days, they controlled enough delegates to control the nomination, and they let it be known that no, Henry Ford was not a go, and Henry Ford then said, okay, well, I'm not running unless the parties draft me, which meant he wasn't running at all, which meant he got nowhere. More recently, 1976, George Wallace was running for president. The Democrats began to realize that he could get enough votes to become a spoiler in the race, or God help them, if he became the nominee, he would massively lose. He was unacceptable outside the South, and of course, he was a racist, right? So Republican operatives went to the candidates in Florida in the primary there and said, all candidates except Jimmy Carter, please get out of the Florida primary. That way we'll have only one Southerner in the race against Wallace. Carter will win. Wallace will be driven from the race. Believe it or not, the candidates did that because the party asked them to, with the exception of Henry Jackson, who turned out not to be a factor. The result of that is that George Wallace was marginalized from the race. Actually, Jimmy Carter then went on to become president, which was not expected. I have to tell you, folks, I am not sad that gatekeepers kept George Wallace from becoming a spoiler, or God help us, even president in 1976. 1992, Patrick Buchanan was forced from the race because the North Dakota primary was basically made it very hard for him to run. Lyndon LaRouche was pushed out by the Democrats. He was a crazy right-wing person. He wanted to run as a Democratic spoiler. He was basically manipulated off the ticket. This has happened again and again in American history. And I argue there is nothing wrong with it. You need some professional gatekeeping in the process at the extreme. So the system worked actually amazingly well for about 200 years. The parties seemed impregnable. We took for granted the presidential candidates would be qualified, even if they were newcomers like Jimmy Carter. You know, he was a successful governor for 4 years, right? Barack Obama, what did I just say, Obama? Pardon me? Barack Obama was a senator for only 4 years, but clearly a formidable guy and acceptable to the party as a whole. Most of the people running were people with deep backgrounds in politics. We just assume that this automatically happened, maybe because only really good people run for president. Because we assume that politics was self-organizing, we got two major waves of reforms. First, the progressives around 100 years ago got rid of stuff like patronage jobs. George Washington Plunkett hated that. He thought the parties would die without patronage jobs. He was wrong. Those reforms worked out okay. We got a second wave in the 70s, and that went after stuff like campaign contributions and privacy. And then we had more recently crusades against pork barrel spending and earmarks, as they're called. And one by one, these tools were deemed corrupt, and they were taken away. They were noble, idealistic. I was on board for a lot of them. I was at one point a believer in the anti-corruption model of politics, where you clean it up by getting rid of all the sleaze and graft. But what they were doing was little by little removing parties and professionals' control over things like campaign money. They actually passed laws that said parties cannot coordinate with their own candidates for campaigning except with very small, limited amounts of money that's very hard to raise. That's just crazy. Parties' entire job is to coordinate among candidates, right? You run for this, you run for that, we'll support you for this. Here's what the ticket is saying, here's our strategy. Pork and earmarks became difficult. Privacy, much more difficult. Lots of recorded votes now. All the committee meetings that do markups are open. The problem there is that it's very hard to get stuff done because everyone's posturing in public. And the nominations are done now by primaries. And we see the result of that is it turns out to be very easy for factions and minorities to hijack those primaries if they get the sequencing right. So, I mean, this seemed to work well for a while. The parties, the professionals found other less direct ways to influence. Those two were removed. I had the first big wake-up call that something was wrong in 2011. This is when I started really thinking about it. We had a big budget deal. It was a good budget deal. The president and majorities in both parties were for it. It would have trimmed entitlements, spending. It would have dealt with some defense stuff, some tax issues. It's the kind of big deal that we need if we're going to get, the fiscal house in order. It failed. It failed because a minority of Republicans blocked it. Now, in principle, that shouldn't be able to happen. The problem here was that the majority couldn't get itself organized enough to overcome the minority, so the bill died. The same thing more or less happened with immigration reform in 2013, with results that I believe are catastrophic. This is the issue that propelled Trump to power, that he is using every day with his base. That might never have happened if the comprehensive immigration bill, which I think would have had a majority and a free vote in both houses of Congress and presidential support, had succeeded in 2013. We've had multiple debt limit fiascos where the government has almost defaulted on its national debt. We have the appropriations problems, the government shutdowns, and what we have here is a problem not of forming a majority, forming a consensus. It is true, if there's no consensus, then maybe we shouldn't act. This is a problem of organizing around the consensus that exists, which is what politics is supposed to be able to do. Two great statements of this got my attention a few years ago. One was from Trent Lott, the former Senate Majority Leader, famously said, "Trying to be a leader where you have no sticks and very few carrots is dang near impossible. And the one that really tugs at my heartstrings, even more famously, John Boehner, Speaker of the House, Republican, driven out of power by a minority of his caucus in 2014 after a completely pointless government shutdown that was engineered by Ted Cruz and a small band of renegades because Cruz wanted to run for president, was asked why this happened. Boehner himself called it a very predictable failure. Boehner's response to Jay Leno was, I quote, "A leader without followers is just a man taking a walk." What we began to realize is we were not seeing a crisis of leadership in American politics. We were seeing a crisis of followership, a crisis of being very difficult to organize these 535 people and these multiple branches and levels of government into coherent majorities. Today, it's very hard for the Democratic and Republican national committees to even influence their own nominees. We saw that 2016, remember the fuss when the DNC seemed to be putting its fingers on the scale for Hillary Clinton, and this was a scandal? You all remember that? And this led to demands to reduce the power of superdelegates, who are the professionals and careerists who would go to the convention and have their own votes. That was intended to be a speed bump to make sure that no one like Donald Trump got the nomination. Their power was reduced because everyone was so mad that the Democratic Party was trying to put its thumb on it. So, well, what it was trying to do was what parties are supposed to do. Prefer the candidate who is a Democrat with a long record of service to the party over the person who is not a Democrat. In April of 2016, Hillary Clinton had raised $10 million for other candidates in the Democratic Party. Guess how much Bernie Sanders had raised? I'm seeing zeros. That's functionally accurate. He raised $1,000 because that's the amount you needed to open a bank account, right? The party's supposed to be able to do that. The mistake, the problem was that they couldn't defend it. They should have been able to say, of course we favor the Democrat for the Democratic nomination. That's our job. You should have to be a Democrat to receive the stamp of approval. Bernie Sanders is lucky he can run. He registered as a Democrat on the last possible day so he could enter the New Hampshire primary. So, this is where we are today. George Washington Plunkett saw it coming. He was talking here about patronage, which was about to be outlawed, or actually had been outlawed. But the point generalizes. He said, I quote, "First, this great and glorious country was built up by political parties. Second, parties can't hold together if their workers don't get the offices when they win. Third, if the parties go to pieces, the government they built up must go to pieces too. Fourth, then there will be hell to pay." Well, I would argue the hell to pay is what we're paying right now. Donald Trump, not a Republican, any meaningful sense, a complete renegade, accountable only to himself. And I know there are Trump supporters in the room. My card's on the table. I'm a never Trumper. You don't have to agree with me on any of this. But I think Trump is a sign of this problem. I think the fact that on the debate stage you have a vice president of the United States and a self-help author there at the same time, there's something seriously wrong with that picture when a party's allowing that to happen. Ironically, the reforms of the last year have failed even their own tests. They promised, if we got rid of soft money and political action committees were regulated and all the other things, transparency, sunlight is the best disinfectant, all the rest of it. We were promised that the system would work better. We were promised that the system would be cleaner. And we were promised that the public would have more trust in the system, more belief in the system. None of those things is true. The system works worse. No one thinks it's cleaner. Trust in government is lower. So what we have here is a comprehensive failure of a model which viewed the big problem in American politics as rooting out corruption and defined corruption in a way which, although sometimes accurate, too often included too much of what ordinary politicians have to do to organize their world. And as long as that is the case, I fear, in fact, I believe that hostile takeovers, renegade behavior, chaos, collapse in Congress, that it will happen again and again. So, there's good news. It's always nice to end on a good news note. The situation isn't hopeless. In fact, I'm seeing green shoots. I'm seeing a lot of them. One thing that's nice to know is that there are lots of very doable reforms. There's lots of stuff you can change that would undo some of this damage. And I'll tick them off. We could talk about them. They're in my papers. They're not really the point. But the point is to give a sense that there are menus of things that people are talking about. You could lift the bans on parties' ability to coordinate with their own candidates using unregulated money. You could lift the caps, which are very low, on how much people can contribute to political parties. In my opinion, that would be good because it would mean more money would go into the parties, which are accountable and can dole them out in ways that hold others accountable, and instead of to the outside groups like the Koch brothers, who are spending untold tens of millions of dollars with accountability to no one. You could deregulate the state parties. Their hands are tied. There's much less that they can do than their competitors in the forms of the private groups and the special interests. There's a ton of state parties out there. There's a lot of infrastructure waiting to be reinflated. You could allow earmarks, and a lot of people want to do that in both parties. It's hard to do because it's a tough vote, because it looks really bad, because everyone says, oh my God, there they go being corrupt again. But a lot of people want to do it. You could allow more privacy in negotiations. There are proposals to do that. There should be more voice votes, for example, under these proposals, fewer recorded votes. That way you don't have so many of these weaponized amendments, where most of what Congress votes on every day is not legislation that's going to be passed and signed, because it'll die in the other chamber or the president won't sign it. Most of these votes are set up to embarrass the other party so that they have to vote for them or against them, so you can use it in a campaign ad. So those votes shouldn't even be on the floor, right? They should be killed in committee before they get there. You could have more of what's called regular order. There's a big consensus for that in both parties. There are reasons why it's not the easiest thing to do, but that's the old system where instead of the Speaker of the House trying to decide what the agenda is, or Mitch McConnell having all the power, you actually have committee chairs with power, and you have subcommittees that are cranking out legislation and moving up, and it has floor privileges so it can actually come to a vote, and then you can go to, it's the process the way we were taught it worked when my generation was in civics class. Lots of people want to do that. You can have stronger peer review in the selection process. That means superdelegates should be stronger, not weaker. That means in order to get on the debate stage, for example, instead of just showing that you can raise money from small donors and that you have good poll ratings, you should be able to show perhaps, for example, that you can win endorsements from people in the party. You should be able to show that you've held high office. I mean, a president, a vice president next to a self-help guru. Maybe the self-guru should have had office in order to be on the top ticket on the debate stage. There are lots of criteria you can use for these early parts of the system to say, look, you have to be someone, you have to accomplish things. And by the way, wouldn't it be nice to say that if you're in a Democratic debate, you should actually be a registered Democrat? And maybe even have been a registered Democrat for 10 years? I know Bernie Sanders fans don't like that idea, but I think it would lead to better political outcomes. Congress wants to make changes. People up there are incredibly frustrated. Even though it's a terrible job because they don't actually pass legislation. They're just voting on all these weaponized votes. They want to legislate again. Interestingly, activists and interest groups, some of the people who've been responsible for the reform movements that have torn down a lot of what I think are the necessary tools, have realized that this is not going well. And we're seeing interest from places like the Brennan Center now in restoring some of these tools and think there's a rethink going on. And that's a very positive thing because grass tops influencers are the people who will set the agenda and legitimize change and make it okay for folks like the people in this room to start favoring some of these reforms. Also, in my opinion, not unimportantly, Zach Corser is on board, I think. Is Zach Corser on board? We got 2 hands up. Is George Thomas on board? 2 hands up. So everything that I've been saying to you, although not uncontroversial, everything I've been saying to you is political science 101 for probably 50, 60, 70 years. We're talking about Banfield and Wilson. The political science community has not been heard in the reform debate for various reasons, but there's a whole ton now of very solid, especially in the last 5 years, very solid political science literature showing why, for example, smoke-filled rooms have actually historically picked candidates who are more broadly appealing and more qualified and more diverse than non-smoke-filled rooms. There's lots of stuff like that now to draw on. So there's a lot to work with here. So here's the hard question, the question I want to leave you with and maybe talk about. We have until 8, is that right? 8 o'clock. So, you know the old joke? How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Anyone? No one knows this joke? Yeah. Only one, but the bulb has to really want to change. So here's the question. Do we really want to change? The attack on intermediation in politics is deeply ingrained. We've all grown up with the idea that if politicians go behind closed doors, they will get up to no good. We've all grown up with the idea money in politics, bad. We've grown up with the idea direct primaries, how else would you do it? I mean, how could you stop a George Wallace, for example? Well, you can't because he's entitled to run and the party's not allowed to say boo about it. We've deeply ingrained all of these ideas. The very peculiar spectacle that we have now of the news media doing the gatekeeping, that's really weird when you think about it. You know, we have these debates and the news media are there, and then the news media tell us who won and who lost, and that's what gives the candidates momentum. That's also historically very peculiar. So a lot of this stuff that's going on, but the point I'm making is we all take it for granted. How else would it work? Americans generally don't even see institutions. We look right past them. We have a very individualistic model of politics. You know, it's the individual voter and the individual candidate, and anything that gets in between, a gatekeeper, a party, a machine, someone saying, well, actually, we're not putting that person on the ballot, so you can't vote for them, for example. That's seen as unfair and undemocratic. We also have a very consumerist idea of politics. This is the idea more choice is always better. Politicians are like cereal. You want 20 to choose from, not just 3. If you go to your political science, you'll find out that when you get above a certain number, people just get more confused and the choices get a lot worse and not better. So you actually need some pre-screening. But people think, no, I want choice. You know, I'm a consumer in politics as a voter. And then we have the black backlash, not just in the United States, but also we're seeing it in Europe, a lot of the world, against the so-called establishment. We're seeing a lot of nihilism, a lot of burn, baby, burn attitude toward political infrastructure, things like parties. We're seeing it in the UK right now. We're seeing it in Israel to some extent. We're certainly seeing it here. And those ideas are pretty broad too. You know, it's hard to make the case, not impossible, but hard to make the case to folks like the people in this room, hey, maybe political parties and machines and hacks and careers, maybe they should be stronger and not weaker. I mean, not totally strong. We don't want them to just run away with the system and do what they want, that they never have been. But maybe we should be involving them more and not less. In order to change our worldview, we've got to start, we'll have to start thinking a little bit differently about what politics is and what politicians actually need in order to do their job. We'll have to educate a little bit differently in schools, in classrooms, political science here in college, civics, if there still is any civics, in grade school, high school. Reteach why institutions matter, why it's important that they be able to do their job. Civics education would really help. We don't have as much of it as we should. That breeds suspicion and nihilism. And we'll need to think in a new way, or maybe I should say more accurately, an old way, a very old way, a way that is until very recently in American history, the way our parents and grandparents just took for granted things worked. The proposition that I want to defend to all of you is that my parents' and grandparents' generation, your grandparents, great-grandparents, they were not all dolts and crooks. They might have understood some things about how to organize politics, how to get things done in a complicated world. If that's the case, then we'll need to begin focusing on a more institution-centered agenda, an agenda that emphasizes intermediaries and parties and all that boring stuff. And then folks like me and folks like maybe a handful of you in this room will need to go out from this place and begin to argue for it, begin to push back when someone says, those Democratic superdelegates, that's so corrupt, we shouldn't be allowing that. It means one of us saying, hey, wait a minute, just a minute here. Maybe they're doing something kind of important that we all depend on. So I'm ready to do that, and that's why I'm here tonight. And I hope that at least some of you will consider these alternative points of view. Take a look at Political Realism. I call it an ebook. It's really a long article. It's free. You can get it on the Brookings website or Amazon. Did an article in Atlantic. And there's lots of stuff out there. If any of you in political science courses, you may have read this stuff or talked about it. Talk it up. Your generation, when I talk to folks, I find that they are pretty consistently pragmatic. They understand things are broken, and they're a little bit tired of the labels and, the standard tropes. I'm really hopeful that the group in this room is gonna find a new balance. So with that, apparently inadvertent advertisement for a running shoe, why don't we talk for a bit? We have 15, 20 minutes, so. Thank you all.
We now have time for questions. Please raise your hand and Lale and I will come to you with the microphone. Please stand up when you ask a question and do try to keep it brief. And as always, priority will go to students.
Hi, thank you so much for your speech.
Thank you. Could everyone just say what college and where they're from and what year?
Yeah, I'm from Claremont, McKenna. I'm a sophomore and I'm from Los Angeles.
Super, thank you.
So I was
Thank
wondering.
you for coming.
Huh?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. I was wondering specifically your thoughts on campaign finance, because sometimes the interests of the money are in opposition to the interests of the people. Like pharmaceutical companies like Purdue's interests being overprescription, which in this case has been in opposition to the interests of the people, as we've seen with the opioid epidemic. How does returning to old school political machines prevent those kinds of interests, oppositions from happening?
Great question. So the first part of the answer will disappoint you, which is you can't prevent special interests from influencing politics. That's their job. It's written in the Constitution, and Madison's system was not to prevent special interest in factions from having influence. It was to make sure there were so many of them that they would balance out, fight each other to a standstill. Politicians would play them off against each other, organize them into coalitions, and that's how we do our social bargaining. So this is not, if it's done right, this is special interest influence is inevitable and probably a feature, not a bug. So what about money? So, okay, so you have all this money. And how many of you think that private spending on politics is corrupt? Is that a common view in this room? It's a very common view outside the room, that it's a source of corruption for someone to be able to write a check to a political candidate and then probably get access, heightened access. The literature on this shows that they don't actually get legislation through. That almost never happens. There's no support, but they do get access because politicians are more likely to talk to their supporters. That's a law of nature in politics. That's the job in politics. Who are my supporters? And I need to talk to them. So here's the thing. Campaign money also creates attachments between politicians and interests. It gives them a stake in not being renegade, not doing crazy. It means they're going to talk to the drug makers, for instance, before they do a big reform bill. And if there's a lot of money in the system, they're going to have to talk to a lot of people. So a lot of the smartest thinking on this, and the school that I associate with says, okay, so you're going to have the money. It's going to go somewhere, right? Because the Supreme Court has told us you cannot tell Charles Koch, for example, he's a billionaire, he spends a lot of money on politics. You can't tell him not to spend his money doing stuff in politics. So his money is out there. What do you do about that? Well, the question is, if the money is going somewhere, where do you want it to go? The private groups, the outside groups, people like Tom Steyer on the left or Koch on the right, they're accountable to no one but themselves. They do their thing. In many cases, they don't even have to report what they're doing. Who's accountable in the system? Well, the candidates are accountable because they face voters, but you don't necessarily want someone dropping a $10 million check in a House race, right? So people say, well, there are these big institutions that are so large that even a $10 million check is a drop in the bucket, and whose jobs are to take a lot of interests and aggregate them, balance them, try to build coalitions, and that are accountable because they have to win elections, and that are transparent because there are tons of reporting rules. What are those? Anyone know? Who am I talking about? Right, the political parties. So there's a movement which has some support in a number of circles that says, so that's where the money should be going. Lift the caps on donations to political parties so that Tom Steyer and Charles Koch can write their checks to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, where they will have some influence for sure. But these parties are spending hundreds of millions of dollars in presidential races and having to listen to a lot of voices. So the notion here is there's no perfect place for the money, but that's probably the safest place. So that's the kind of thinking that I would use. It's not how do we get rid of the money, it's where do we want the money to go. The answer to all these questions, by the way, is going to be, remember, in politics there are no guarantees. You're never going to get all political behavior to be nice and orderly and sweet and friendly. That's not what we're going for. We're going for the least bad solution. Thank you. It's a great question.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Tobin Hansen. I'm a senior here at Claremont McKenna College from the Seattle area.
Great. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Partially in a follow-up to that previous question, you cited Madison's reliance on so many factions that are opposing that we end up getting a societally enhancing outcome. But I think so often we're more concerned that, well, sure, there are many interests at the table, but for taking the example of trade policy, I think people care much more about what the Financial Services Roundtable has to say than the AFL-CIO. So how do you go about enabling labor, environment, all these other concerned parties that don't have the kinds of financial resources to compete with the business world and the financial interests, when the proposal that you have is that through financial means these different interest groups are going to be battling it out for the ear of politicians? How do you go about addressing that nexus of power and that imbalance in this new system or old system?
Another great question. This is subtle stuff, and it's hard to do in very brief answers, so I'll kind of more indicate a direction, and I'll be able to give a detailed reply. There's a bunch of stuff there to unpack. I'm someone who's been a public advocate of changing and loosening the rules on unions so that they can thrive again. I'm of the group who thinks that the collapse of unions has been a social disaster for the country and a big source of the resentment that we're seeing. And the same is true of the parties. They've also had their hands tied. So there's a lot you can do for some of the specific organizations you're talking about, but I take your question to be more broad, which is we live in a highly unequal society. And it's become a lot more unequal, and that means we have oligarchs and plutocrats who can spend a lot of money in politics, and other people can't. And how do we equalize that? I'm afraid the answer to that is not very satisfying, but perhaps necessary, which is we got to work on the problem of inequality, and that's going to involve some changes in a lot of different policies. But you can't do it for the political system by shutting the money out, because the money will just go somewhere underground where you can't track it. That's the problem we're talking about earlier. And now I'm going to sound like a broken record and get to the third part of your question. I'm revealing my obsession here, but I honestly think there's a lot of research and a lot of good thinking that supports this answer. It's the same as the answer to the previous question. So in politics, whose job is it to think beyond the immediate special interest of winning a particular race? Like, suppose in race A, some candidate can win by completely selling themselves out to the pharmaceutical lobby, right? That's going to get them elected, so they're going to do that. What entity in politics is in a position to say, hey, that's not a good idea, that'll hurt the rest of us, that'll cause a scandal, that'll damage our image, we shouldn't be doing it, and maybe I'll give you an alternative. Parties. They don't invariably do the right thing, but to the extent there is a source of pressure, they can do that. And the other part of your question is, how do you equalize for the unspoken for groups? So I alluded to this earlier. One of the most interesting aspects of the literature on political machines and parties is that when they're powerful, they're actually more inclusive than direct democracy. Well, why would that possibly be? Like, wouldn't they want to shut out blacks and women and minorities? And the answer is, well, no, actually. It turns out the people who turn up for elections, especially in primaries, are an unrepresentative group. They're wealthier, they're whiter, they're better educated, they're more ideological, they're more focused on particular issues than the people who turn out in general elections. And those people are not generally like the whole public. So who wants to try to recruit as many new people to the camp as they can? Who wants to bring in voices, and who wants to nominate candidates and have programs that may activate some of these voices and bring them in, mobilize them? Once again, it's typically parties and machines that have done that historically. Here's a little known fact. This was new to me when I started doing this research. So you've all heard terrible things about Tammany Hall. You've heard how corrupt it is and how evil it is. This is history written by the winners being the progressive movement. Progressives in the late 19th century, you all know these are the capital P progressives, not the modern, liberal left of center progressives. These progressives believed that the Irish working class was a essentially lower form of life. They were appalled by the political machines and the power they were giving to the poor, uneducated, and especially the Irish. In New York State, the legislature actually passed a piece of legislation, a poll test to disenfranchise these voters altogether. What they especially hated and resented about Tammany was that they were bringing in all these people and empowering them to do all this dirty politics. The progressives wanted the smart, educated meritocracy to do this, and they wanted to exclude those people. And part of them, they won that fight, and part of the result of that is the way history is written. So I know I sound like a broken record, and I will not kid you. I can never foresee a time when inequality will cease to be a problem in American life. I'm not saying that. It's a worse problem now than ever. I am thinking, given the situation we're in, who's in the best position to deal with it? It's people who have incentives to be more rather than less inclusive. There's one in the way, way, way back.
This will be our last question of the evening.
My name is Sammy. I'm a senior at CMC. I'm from Mexico City and San Diego, California.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. In the newest class of freshmen members of Congress, we've seen their use of social media impact the way they interact with their constituents and with the nation as a whole. Do you think their use of social media, and maybe the president's also, has corroded the power of the parties to regulate what they say and to regulate the actions
for sure.
of members
Big
of Congress?
time. So there are two, I'll give you guys a quick briefing on what I think are the two most powerful arguments against the case that I'm making. One is, well, if you give the machine more power, you have to look at who's actually running the machine, and the Republican machine now is being run by Donald Trump. They've taken it over, and they have. Trump is a good machine builder. Whatever his other flaws are, he gets this aspect of politics. The very first thing he did, like right away when he got to the Oval Office, was begin combing the country and getting rid of state and local party chairs who were not on his team. So that's a problem. Second problem is, I will get to your question, but I'm going to put a bigger frame around it. People say, look, this is an exercise in nostalgia. You can't have Tammany Hall anymore. You can't even have anything remotely like an old machine anymore, because all the ways that the gatekeepers used to manage the environment don't work anymore. Like, you used to have 3 big television networks. It was a really, really big deal if NBC, CBS, and ABC weren't sending a correspondent to cover your campaign. That meant you aren't on the news, which meant you didn't really have a shot. Well, now they communicate directly, and to a very large extent, that's a good thing. And even if it weren't a good thing, it's life, right? So the social media environment has changed. The money environment has changed. Like it or not, a lot of people like it. Some people like me have mixed feelings about it. You can put out the word by email, Instagram, whatever. People click a button, and they made a campaign contribution, $25, bing, just like that. So that's really cool in many ways. It also has a big downside, which is it makes it easier for nut jobs to run for office if they're good at mobilizing small donors, energizing them by saying nutty things. So the point here is that it is what we've got to do, and this is why I ended with a plea to your generation, is not try to go back to politics as it was practiced in the time of George Washington Plunkett or Henry Ford or George Wallace or any of those times. What we need to do is look at what our grandparents were trying to accomplish, what the problem was that they had their hands around and were trying to solve. And remember, at every stage, they also had to innovate to solve those problems. Radio was a huge political innovation. Think about this. Suddenly, a politician didn't have to get on a train and go visit somewhere to be heard. Overwhelming change, hugely empowered Franklin Roosevelt, but they had to invent stuff to deal with it. We live in this environment of social media, and the job for me, but especially for you, is to figure out ways to reinvent mechanisms that will accomplish some of what our forefathers were doing in the modern environment. I think we have some ideas of how some of those might look, but it's only in the very early stage. So that's why I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to at least raise these questions with you. If you go and read Tom Mann, for example, also Brookings, E.J. Dionne, they will tell you all the reasons I'm wrong. Maybe they're right and I'm wrong. But here's something I'm confident of. In this room tonight, we are asking the right questions. We've got to figure out how to reduce the amount of chaos in politics. Because if we don't, how many years of this are we good for? Thank you all so much for having me here tonight. Really.